Hi, it's Norman Kochneck here. I've been providing you with a number of historical or cricket series updates on a number of the grounds that exist in Australia, as well as the top 10 oldest grounds, and a number of the features about the history of cricket around both Australia and the world. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about the Brisbane Cricket Ground, better known as the Gabba. So this ground is not in the top 10 oldest grounds, but it has a rich history nonetheless, especially of cricket within Australia. It in fact has had such memorable events as the Tide Test in 1960-61, in which the likes of Wes Hall, Garfield Sobers, Richie Benaud, Alan Davidson all performed. Even Lance Gibbs was 12th man in that match. So let's look at the history of both the Brisbane ground, the Gabba, and its surrounds and the structures that exist within the ground. Firstly, it was actually called the Brisbane Cricket Ground, but in fact it's been colloquially known as the Gabba. Now the reason why it's called the Gabba is because it actually is situated in a Brisbane suburb called Woolloongabba. Now that suburb itself has a lot of history actually. It's one of those suburbs where you could argue that the history is based on an Aboriginal name. Woolloongabba, of course, is an Aboriginal name, and there's been divided belief as to what it really does actually mean. It either means whirling waters, Woolong and Cubbon, which is where Woolloongabba comes from, so it's either whirling waters, or in fact, a fight talk place. So that's two Aboriginal meanings that actually that undertake the name Woolloongabba, and hence the name the Gabba, which has stuck since day one, since it was part of the Brisbane Cricket Club. The irony with the Brisbane Cricket Club, of course, is that it's not just a cricket ground. It actually has a lot to do now with AFL, the Australian Football League itself, and that tends to have a lot of significance in the ground itself. So it was actually first in 1895 that the ground was first used had its first match as a cricket ground, and effectively that was well after the other grounds in Australia, namely the Sydney Cricket Ground, the MCG and Adelaide Oval, but it had a great deal of significance. That particular ground, like most of the cricket grounds, seemed to come from barracks, as in military barracks, and then they moved to the ground to then use it as a proper cricket ground, and the English influence, of course, on cricket. Now, it actually had its first so-called Sheffield Shield match in 1931, and it effectively had some history from that point onwards. But its first test match was actually in that same year of 1931, so effectively the Bradman era it started to be used as a test ground. 1960-61, of course, they had their famous Tide Test, as I mentioned before, Australia and the West Indies, with some greats. But interestingly, up until that point, it was mainly a cricket ground. But in 1972, it had, of course, its great surrounds, a great hill and a great Morgan Bay figs, the trees, Moreton Bay figs, the actual trees that adorn one end. But it actually then also enlisted itself as developed into a greyhound track or a dog track in 1972, and was used that way weekly for 21 years until 1993. So effectively it was a cricket ground where the cricketers would play, and then if they hit the ball hard enough to the boundary, it would actually go on to what they would call a dog track, which is quite an unusual situation around the ground. But that ceased to exist in 1993 when that ground became what they would call a proper full stadium with seating around the entire ground, and not just simply a traditional ground with a hill. You would argue that it lost some of its charm when it lost its hill and its Moreton Bay figs and its lovely setting. At one end there was actually the southeastern end of the ground. Then it became a cylindrical stadium seating all the way around, which obviously made it a better viewing platform for cricket and for the eventual AFL, the Australian Football League, the Aussie Rules as we call it. But it did change its character somewhat. So it traditionally has a Vulture Street end, which is the northern end, and a Stanley Street end, which is the so-called southern end. So there, when you often hear the game's been played there, you'll hear Vulture Street end, the bowling from, or the Stanley Street end. So that's effectively where that came from. So that was the reason behind this. The Vulture Street end has what they effectively call the members area, and it works around to what they call the Queensland Cricketers Club, also a part of the stadium, and it works around to the main stands all the way around, with also an area for the Brisbane Lions, which is the AFL team that has one end of it as well. But effectively it's one set of grandstands all the way around. So it's quite an incredible stadium, and you feel fairly close to the action. It holds some 38,000 people, probably not as traditionally big as, say, some of certainly the SCG and obviously the MCG, not nearly in that capacity around, but it still has a great deal of quality. It's normally used as the first test test of the season, although in the recent Indian series we've got now, it's been used as the last test. So that's a rather unusual quirk. So usually the first, Australia likes to play there. They haven't actually lost a match there since 1988. And that's traditionally a fast, bouncy pitch, very green top, and obviously catering for fast bowlers, and Australia tends to have a lot of them. But yeah, the way that India's playing, it's probably a slightly changed situation. It obviously is famous for as I said, the 1960-61 tie test. It also was a very famous haunting ground for Shane Warne. He took a number of wickets on that particular wicket, and had one of the first 2020 internationals in Australia on that field as well. So it has a rich history. By all means, in 1972, it had its dog tracks. 1993, it had a certain era. The Jeff Thompsons and the Doug Walders were playing that ground, and you see the traditional dog track. It had a lot of character. Since then, of course, it's a complete surround stadium, has great features, and certainly worth going to. So again, the Gabba, Woolloongabba, the suburb, Brisbane suburb of Woolloongabba is why it's called the Gabba, the Brisbane Cricket Ground. I hope you enjoyed that. I'll try to bring you more stadiums throughout the series. This is Norman Kochnak going through the series of history of grounds around Australia and beyond.